Okay, you want to talk about the Pivot podcast? Go ahead.
So in our first session, I guess we talked about podcast security, and one of the things that came to mind was why we want to stay anonymous. And one of the points that came up early on in the Pivot podcast was that certain billionaires and other figures on the right were vilifying the host of the Pivot podcast and the guests of the Pivot podcast for certain positions they take. And I was just thinking that is a perfect example why we want to and should remain anonymous.
Yeah, I think I remember that part where he said that they were going after the lady, and he said, you know, how manly of you to go after her instead of me. I'm the one who said it.
But what I would ask him is that he come after me when I say things like, wow, Elon Musk appears to have made a hard right in his politics, or that the new Tesla Model SS is coming out. I say those things. You don't.
I know.
And if he's going to accuse me of overreach, then come after me, bitch. To go after the woman, it shows one of two things. Either you're weak or you have an incredible bias, misogynist. If the man says something about you and you keep going after the woman who's near him, that just implies incredible weakness on your part.
Yeah.
He said, you've got the Tesla SS. He was making Hitler jokes against him. And yeah, I remember that part.
Okay. The problem I see with de-anonymizing yourself or letting people know who you are is that when you do that, you can't take it back. It's forever. And we live in an age where life-altering media has an impact on, a real-life impact on people's lives. And for me, I kind of took that to heart, and I looked at the hosts and the guests, and I was like, you see, they're a little bit older, so they don't really care. Like, I don't believe that they're not working adults, right? They're either retired or semi-retired, and this is kind of like their second or third career.
Yeah.
And they just do this for fun.
Yeah.
So, and maybe they're making a little bit of money on the side. You know,
they don't have to do it.
Right. They choose to do it.
Yeah.
And we just do this for fun. But
yeah.
We're not getting paid to do any of this.
No.
But I think we both kind of recognize that there is a need in the country for reasonable voices and rational thinking to be injected into the discourse of American topics. And politics is one of them. There's a slew of other topics that you can get into that you feel passionate about. And I'm sure we will get into that in the future. But it was kind of a validation that, you know, our decision to remain anonymous, I think it's the right decision for us right now. And obviously it's early on, and will that change? Who knows? But that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. I thought it was kind of interesting just out of the gate that they just were complaining about the fact that they were being attacked on social media, which isn't a real place anyway, but they were being attacked nonetheless there. And apparently they didn't like it. Prof G was kind of getting defensive and protective of the female, and you know, maybe he needed to, maybe he didn't need to, maybe it doesn't matter. But I was just like, you know, well, this is exactly, if you're anonymous, they have who can they attack? It's just text in a tweet or an X that doesn't really mean anything.
Well, that's the thing.
And you don't have to respond to it.
Is that if I have a view, I don't mind someone countering my view, right? And us not coming to terms. We both see things differently.
Yeah.
But why does it always have to escalate to you need to be canceled, you need to be fired from wherever you work, right? It goes way beyond anything reasonable. And the thing is, they'll move on to another topic in 3 months. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? They're all worked up about this topic, but they don't really care. It's gone in a couple months. It's a way overreaction. There's 2 points I would say to follow on to your response there. Number one is, are these real people, or are they individuals behind the screen in some foreign country? I think that's it's a worthwhile question to ask, and it's one that more than ever I think has more meaning, and it shouldn't just be scoffed at or disregarded offhand. We know for a fact that foreign countries, they engage in psychological operations to convince and persuade and in some cases cajole
individuals of other countries using social media platforms to push them in a certain direction.
Or fund them unbeknownst to them through a shell company.
Right. In this case, I'm saying when somebody's making a comment on a message board or on Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, you don't know who that person is who's saying that. And if that person isn't verified as being a citizen of your country, do you want them to have a voice in your internal discourse? And I think it's worth mentioning that because we know it happens. And there's another point that I think is just as important, which is, let's say it is a citizen. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. Mm-hmm. You say what you want to say, especially if you're a citizen of the United States. You can say what you want to say, but you also have to respect and accept the fact that somebody's not going to like it and they're not going to agree with it. But that doesn't mean that what you have to say matters less than they do. So what do you do with that? If they're a citizen, well, I think you just say, you accept it. I have a right to speak, you have a right to speak. Mm-hmm. We don't have to agree. That's the beauty of living in a free country.
Yeah.
Not a free world, a free country. And I think people, they get confused about that. If you're an individual who lives in Europe and you're using Instagram or Facebook, perhaps you may think that the rules of America apply in your country of origin. That couldn't be further from the truth.
They have harsher controls on their speech.
Yeah.
So I do agree, and I take the same opinion that people can disagree with me, and I don't hate them for that. I don't want them to lose their job for that. I don't want them to die in a gutter somewhere for that. Mm-hmm. All right? It's fine. We disagree, so be it.
Yeah. All right. There was another point that they brought up. I think the exact phrasing was, buying of OpenAI is equivalent to rich man buying Greenland. And it was interesting to hear the equation or the equivalency of these two things.
What was it?
I mean, Professor G made the point that buying OpenAI was equivalent to another rich man buying Greenland. So it's like rich men are just trying to buy up land, they're trying to buy up technology. And
is he saying like physical space and digital space? Or something like that?
It's hard to distinguish because I think, in my estimation, he kind of poses as like a left-leaning individual.
He is.
But he had like a gaffe later on in the podcast where he came across as very conservative. Or at least not very conservative, but like reasonable.
Well, he's a capitalist too, so that's the thing.
Well,
he's a left-leaning capitalist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure what he was trying to say with that comment. I mean, perhaps he was just opining at the point that rich men need to buy everything, maybe to satisfy their egos. I don't know what's going to come of Greenland. I know that there's a national interest in purchasing Greenland because of the natural rare earth minerals that exist that haven't been tapped into, but we know exist in Greenland.
The melting ice caps might make a path. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's easier to trade going over the top of the earth than crossing the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean.
It saves time. That's what I've heard and read too. And of course, there's also been discussion that the Trump administration wants to admit Canada as the 51st state.
Now, come on, don't you think that's a troll?
Yeah. I mean, I just don't see how because we have 16 Commonwealths. Why wouldn't one of them become the 51st, 52nd, 50? Why wouldn't they be added on to the flag?
Because he's just trolling them. Because he knew they'd all get upset about it, and they start chitter-chatting about that.
Well, I do think he does want, like, even in his first administration, he was trying very hard to bring over fabrication plans and manufacturing capacity that directly ties into the silicone that we use for most of our technology. Satellites, cars, computers, laptops, phones, of course, military-grade weapons, and other things. So it's in line with what he was trying to do, he being Trump, in his first administration. I remember vaguely that there was a push to get Australia to expand the exploration of rare earth minerals on that continent. And so I just think it's in line. Even recently he was talking about the war in Ukraine and that he wanted to end the war and potentially split the land so that the United States could have access to the rare earth minerals that were there. And I guess that was a non-starter for Zelensky, or just like, absolutely not. But, I mean, the comment, just regarding buying Greenland and admitting Canada to the Union, I think it's all the theme, the underlying theme, which is the motivating factor, is rare earth minerals. And so he is on the hunt. So Canada has rare earth minerals. Greenland apparently has rare earth minerals, or REM. Australia has REM. Ukraine has REM. And so now, maybe, is there a connection to the Panama Canal? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, maybe you can transport REM faster. I don't know what he's thinking.
My idea, what I got from that was, for one, they don't like billionaires. Okay, that's end all right there.
Yeah,
they don't like them.
They did make a comment.
So they don't
about
like the idea of billionaires buying things up and owning it. I can see what they're saying. They're like cyberpunk futures, where you have governments, right, quote unquote, but really everything is owned by mega corporations, and we're all just serving ultimately them. I mean, even the governments are serving them.
Yeah.
And they see that as being the direction we might be going, and they don't want that.
I remember watching Alien the first time, and I was a kid, and I was like, what is this? It's so different. And I remember watching it and thinking to myself, after watching the movie, like, this is probably what the future is going to be like in terms of space travel. If space is no longer the domain of countries, then it becomes the domain of something, some entity, some agency. What is that? I mean, why not corporations? I think that they're thinking that, because they even made the point that billionaires are too rich. No one person should have all that money. And I've heard this also repeated of individuals who hold a lot of land. Like, no one person should hold all that land. But I think, and just very quickly, a counter argument to that statement is, what about the Indians? I mean, Native Americans, there's like 600 Native American tribes that exist in the United States. They exist as independent nations within a perimeter within the United States, within states within the United States. But they don't engage in foreign politics, foreign diplomacy, right? They're responsible for managing their land. But I never hear this argument from the left that says, well, they shouldn't have all that land.
You know why, though, right?
Well, they're the first Americans. But that's still, it's a contradiction. Like, they're saying a family who's existed on a piece of land for a long period of time shouldn't own all that land. But why the exception being the Native Americans? I mean, there was a lot more land taken from the Native Americans too, if you recall. Like, swaths of land, and it wasn't even done. Of course, it was done illegally. They were just forced off the land.
No, listen, there was a legal process that went through, and just because the Indians didn't have judges and court systems and couldn't understand English, doesn't mean it all went through in a legal manner on our side.
Explain the process, the legal process you're talking about.
What I'm saying is, you can do something that is unethical and bad in a legal way. You see what I'm saying? That we knew what we were doing was fucked up. We knew what we were doing is wrong, but we're going to do it anyway. So as long as we can legally do it, then we did it the right way.
So I remember watching this Ken Burns documentary. It's called Into the West. And I'm a historian at heart. It's something that I've always been interested in. And it's kind of a happy place. So I can watch this stuff for hours. The process that existed after the American Revolution was, you get in a wagon, some public official says, ready, set, go. And whoever's the fastest wagon to get to a piece of land that they like, and they plant a stake, that's their land. That was the process.
Good old days.
Unbeknownst to them, they may have been claiming land that belonged to a tribe that happened to be very hostile to the white man.
But we put a flag in it.
No.
Doesn't that make it ours?
Apparently not to the Native Americans who lived there for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So, it is to me. It's just very contradictory. It's I don't think so. The argument I think from their point of view, when they say things like no one person should own all that land or have this much money, is like, well, I mean, so where does that thinking begin and end? Is it just like, well, we give all the land back to the Native Americans?
No, I think ultimately there's no way around it. I think no matter what society you have, there's going to be a small group of people who have the most.
Right. And
the only difference is, I think, that either you have a middle class or you just have a pauper class underneath. So either there's 10% or less that own most everything, and then everyone's poor underneath, or there's a gap there where there's like a middle class and then poor people under that. That's the only difference. But even if it was communism, there'd be somebody in government who owns everything. Like, I watched something not too long ago about Chinese politicians, right? They all have wives in different areas, homes in different areas, right? They're all doing things that they shouldn't be doing.
Right.
So no matter what happens, there's going to be people who accumulate a whole bunch of stuff. There's no way around it. So you just have to live with it.
Yeah, that's why I think the comment, it's interesting to think about, especially when we tie it into like the alien world. And I don't know where the thinking came from. Maybe it came from Ridley Scott, maybe it came from source material. But to me, it slaps so realistically that is going to be the future. That is being, corporations are responsible for exploration, they're responsible for mining operations, they're responsible for research and development, and governments are subservient to them.
Well, I think it's going to be similar to distance in time. People become different. So people came from Britain to America, but there's like a 3-month gap. Remember, you could sail back and forth. So there's a large amount of space, time between them, and over time they identify themselves as different, right? And I think the same thing is going to happen. Like you're saying, if we start a business on Mars, or a business on the moon, or like in The Expanse on the what's it called, the Kuiper Belt or whatever it's called, where all the
asteroids were.
The asteroids are circling around. I think it's between like Mars and something else.
Yeah.
But eventually they will feel connected to each other,
right,
and not so connected to Mars or Earth or the moon, and they will feel we're our own people.
Yeah.
I think it's just a natural thing. And like you said, if it's a business, the business might just incorporate into a government.
So, in the Biden administration, on his way out, he made the comment, beware the technology industrial base. Or technology industrial complex is what he called it. And he might be more, those words may prove to be more prophetic than he even really recognized. Because if you think about what billionaires are doing now, we have a billionaire who was elected president. We have a billionaire who's supporting that president to reduce government spending, increase government efficiency, which arguably, with the approach they're taking, maybe they do it, maybe they don't. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
We're going to know at the end of the administration.
We'll know at the end of the year, but...
No, I mean, probably in 4 years, because there's not a lot of information.
Like I said, we'll know at the end of this year. Did the cuts really happen or not?
Oh, because of the
because they got to pass the budget.
The budget, yeah.
Well, is this true or not? Are they just cutting here to spend more here, and then it balances out to being the same or more? Then what's the... You know what I'm saying? All I can think is, when I say, what's the point then? Vengeance. That's the point, right? It's vengeance disguised under balancing a budget. See, we'll see. We'll see at the end of the year.
And this kind of goes back to the point that how people feel like no one person should be able to have that much control or that much influence or have ownership of this much stuff. And what's kind of happening is, if you look at this objectively, we have right now a situation where very successful men in business are now running the government. Now, I'm going to tie that back together for the corporation. Like the futuristic view that was posed when Alien came out. That, I mean, if you watch that movie and you kind of are a futurist and you kind of peer into your crystal ball outwards, like 50, 100 years, why wouldn't that be a potential future? I mean, we're kind of living it right now. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it is. And who's to say that's not a trend that continues in the future? And why? Well, because I think arguably people will say that, yeah, there is a lot of waste. There is a lot of unnecessary spending. There is a lot of involvement in foreign issues that perhaps don't necessarily directly impact the citizen. Well, when you have an elected leader who also is a businessman, call him the first executive, right? You get somebody who can make decisions that aren't going to be popular very quickly because they have both sides of the coin, and they know, like, the decisions are, they were elected to make decisions. They're going to be able to make those decisions because they have a mandate. And, you know, if it doesn't work out, I mean, they're still a billionaire. They're still the president of their company, the CEO of multiple companies. They still have lots of money. I mean, there's not really much restriction on what they can and can't do. So the future, I think, is very likely going to involve some aspect of a businessman running a corporation that's responsible for managing and ruling vast swaths of territory, whether it be Terra Nova, a planet, or space, or systems, or a galaxy. And that's where my head started going when they made that comment, because I don't know that you can stop it. And this goes back to what you said. I think it's a natural progression.
I mean, it inevitably happens.
Yeah, and I don't think you can stop that.
But what about this? You just remind me. So there's an angle that Scott Adams, he always comes from the persuasion perspective. So let's say you are like Elon Musk, right? You control like the biggest social media platform, let's just say, like Twitter, right? But you also control the largest, most successful AI. Let's just say that's what Grok becomes, right? So as that gets integrated and everything, he can control. So if people start, because recently, I think Sam Altman said that he said ChatGPT-4 is the best search engine. So let's just say people get used to asking AI, hey, what about this? What about that? You got a question, what about this? And you accept its answers, even though we know sometimes AI lies.
Right.
Sometimes AI makes it up. But you're not going to go look it up. You're not going to go double check it. You're just going to take whatever it says and then go forward, right?
Yeah.
So when that's the case, whoever controls AI and social media controls the attention, controls the perspective that people see things, which then affects the government. Because either the person in government is seeing that stuff and is persuading them, or the populace sees it, they're persuaded, and then they elect people or they push people in government to do what they think is their idea, but it's actually just Grok's idea, which is ultimately just Elon's idea. So either way, he's controlling it, but in a subversive way. So I think that's an interesting idea that, I definitely think it's possible in the future.
I mean, there's a separation between what happens in the private sector and what happens in public sector. I think what you're saying isn't out of the realm of possibility, but there's different systems, there's different tools. In many ways, there's just different cultures.
But think about the search engine right now. Google owns what, 90% of it?
Over 90%, yeah.
Okay, but what happens when that's an AI?
But
you just ask it things.
Yeah, but you're assuming. Don't assume that the federal government uses the same tools that the private sector uses.
I know.
Like you and I use.
That's what I'm saying. But as we know, Trump is okay. Previous presidents, yes. We know Biden probably doesn't know how to send an email. He doesn't know how to log into Twitter, right? We know Trump does because all he does is tweet all day, right?
Yeah.
So in the future,
he's on Truth
as
Social,
we have coming in younger people who've grown up with computers, right? Yeah. They might be addicted to social media. Like, even if you listen to the recent All In podcast, they all admit we're addicted. We can't stop checking our phones. We have to know what's going on social media. Those kind of people, they will be persuaded by the algorithm. They will be persuaded by AI. And who's tweaking, who's controlling, the AI? Well, ultimately, it's whoever the big businessman is that owns it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
it is a possible future.
I think a likely scenario. Because I remember hearing tech evangelists, CEOs, etc., just basically arguing that the AI models are good enough, but what ends up happening is they have to be watered down to adhere to regulations and the whims of politicians who are trying to stay in line with the desires of their constituents. I think you've heard me say, I think the best way to advance technology is you have to take the guardrails off and the consequences be damned, because that's the only way you can really solve problems. If you're putting all these restrictions on somebody, let's say you're putting these restrictions on, like, if you're teaching a child to play a sport. I've seen this before. If you're telling them, consistently what not to do, that's what they're thinking about. And then they stop focusing on what they need to do. Well, you can teach both, but there's only so much bandwidth.
I think it's different in tech, which I do agree with the argument that if we put restrictions on tech, it doesn't matter because other countries aren't going to put the same restrictions.
That's another point.
So you can say to yourself, well, we're going to make sure AI doesn't do this. Meanwhile, China makes an AI that does it. So what's the point?
So, so China's an interesting example. They have their own set of regulations and laws and policies and rules, and there's been a dearth of additional policies, rules, and laws that have been passed because of the CCP dealing with a lot of corruption and people leaving the country. So the talent that they grow inside the country, inevitably they realize that it's too much restriction that's being expected. Too much is being expected of them, and too many regulations to follow. So they inevitably leave. So to put a halt to that, they pass laws that require most of your finances to be kept in China. And additionally, you're right. They don't follow the same norms. They claim to, when it's advantageous for them internationally. An example that comes to mind is the South China Sea. But also, they don't have the same issues culturally that a lot of other countries have.
They're more homogenous.
Yeah, they're more homogenous. They have the Uyghurs in the West, which it's kind of surprising that doesn't get more media attention, because that is
it did for a little bit,
but it should have continued, because that is the one example that countries should actually be pointing to often, that highlights racism within another country that typically doesn't really have issues with racism, but because we do, there are groups of people in America that they will post something like, well, is this racism? And that gets a lot of media attention. And so now a company has to stop what they're doing in terms of producing a product or service, and now reallocate resources to deal with this potential issue. And the example that comes to mind is Airbnb. There was a host who opened up his home for people to come and rent for a short period of time. Well, there were white people, there were black people, there were Hispanic people that were applying, and basically what you come to find is that the owner was gaming the system so that only white people could be in his home. He basically gamed the system so that white people would be able to be accepted as visitors to his home and not black or Hispanic or other minorities. Now, the optics of it, yeah, they suck. But, I mean, what's the best way to deal with that?
You have to comply with the... I can guarantee you that... I mean, I haven't seen it, but I guarantee Airbnb would not allow someone to do that.
No. And they changed their policy.
So if you're using their platform, you have to obey their rules.
Right. But my point is like, there's so many instances of these occurrences that can pop up that how much is enough? I mean, if you're spending most of your time policing your platform and not enough time improving it, working on the next product, working on the next iteration of the technology, you're just getting bogged down and dedicating resources to managing a tool that's going to be outdated inevitably, and you're not able to keep up with that because you have countries like China they're doing their own thing. Like, they don't have these same issues that we have. And so that's I'll go back to my position, which is, I think that the best way to utilize AI is you take the guardrails off and let it, with some exceptions, like you don't want people creating nuclear bombs in their home. I don't think that would be good. Or, figuring out how to create ghost guns using a 3D printer, or creating homegrown IEDs or crystal meth. I think there's exceptions to everything, but I still believe that you're not going to get technology. If AI is an assistant, it has to be an untethered assistant. It has to be able to tap into multiple pools of resources to get the answers that you need.
That's only going to happen with changes in the law, because, like you said, people, we can't use certain words, but when people self-delete, recently a guy was talking to his girlfriend chatbot, and he was depressed, and the bot told him, go self-delete yourself.
Oh, yeah.
And he did it, and then they blamed the chatbot,
which was owned by the company, which inevitably takes on liability.
Yeah.
Well, I think so.
So this is the thing. There's always going to be a percent of people who do stuff like this, especially with a large language model, right? And it also, I think, sometimes it happens, I would say, in a natural way, a natural progression. But I think a lot of it is just people forcing. They talk to the AI and they're trying to get it to say it, so they can then make a clip or take a screenshot and say, aha, see? I made the AI say something racist. I made the AI say something sexist. I made the AI tell someone to go self-delete. And then they go, oh no, we're going to get sued. And so now it gets pulled from the market, or they got to
I think that you can't... There's a Supreme Court Justice, I want to say his name is John Roberts. He recently wrote a book. The entire theme of the book is, the more regulations you create, the less freedoms you have.
Yeah.
And you can't regulate your way out of every problem. So there's some common sense that has to be applied to dealing with these issues. And there's going to be issues and concerns that come up. But unfortunately, and this is what the country has become, you have one party who sees the path forward as being regulation, regulation, regulation. You have another party that sees the path forward as being deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. And unless a situation rises that negatively impacts the public, so much so that regulation is desired or is found to be the solution, you're still going to run into this issue where one party doesn't believe in regulation, the other party does. The same players come to the table with the same agendas. And there again is my point, is the advancement of technology, it's not going to happen. It'll happen gradually, which I think technically is what people want to see, especially in power. They want to see a gradual advancement, not a sudden explosion.
Laws lag behind. So it's the advancements happen, and then laws catch up to whatever damage is being done later on. So, but anyway, go ahead and continue. We've gotten far away from the show.
I mean, this is exactly... These are the points I think they should have been talking about. I mean, another note I took was, while listening to that episode, was that I think Professor G has good insights on business decision making. So
he's a very smart man. I told you, he's smart.
He understands the decisions that they're making behind boardrooms, which is really why it's so surprising that he holds some positions that he holds.
He's triggered by it. Listen, we have rational minds, but when our emotions get super involved, it overrides any rationality we have.
I wonder how much of that is actually bona fide, a genuine response versus a manufactured response. Because to me, it seems like he's so rational that when it comes to certain topics, it seems like it's just drama. He's unnecessarily choosing to have an overreaction, and which to me is I'm you lost me here.
I don't know him, but to me it seems genuine. But who knows? I've never talked to him, so how can I know?
Yeah, I mean, I think he made another point that companies the future is going to involve AI data centers, essentially. So data centers that are created not to store data, but to run
just doing the processing.
Yeah, be like one data center for doing like one piece of the language learning model, or perhaps it's what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence.
Yeah.
So maybe they kind of split up the data center into particular pieces or processes that are doing one half of the brain and the other's doing the other half of the brain, and then that gets shipped out to another data center locally that is running other processes, and then they're working in tandem to very quickly provide solutions or responses to users of the system.
Yeah, because as far as I know, the problem is AGI is going to be very expensive, and you don't need AGI to say what's the weather, right? So we can use smaller, less energy intensive things, right? To get you the answer.
Yeah, the example that you would say is, you don't want to ask what the weather is, you want to know what the weather is going to be within a certain level of a high probability.
Well, I mean, there's levels of the question. So, like, if you say what's the weather, it might go to a closer server that just does smaller calculations. But if you say, I need a weather model of the Earth from 1900 to 1950,
that's a lot.
That's going to go up to the big one.
Oh, man, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, it's kind of like...
But those are the type of big questions that I think really, you can't really ask those questions if you're concerned about how, like, what the model is going to present. You can't worry, like, if you're building a product, the last thing you're thinking about is, how can this product be misused?
No, you have to. All of it's included. But the thing is, you cannot foresee and you cannot prevent all misuses.
Right. Like, let me give you a quick example. So, social media, when Facebook came out, like 2000s, something like that, maybe earlier. But who could have predicted that social media could be used to influence an election? Whether it happened or not is irrelevant. It was used to influence an election. That is a fact. But who could have predicted it would have been used in that manner? Who could have predicted that Google's products, its chat services, its willingness to have an open society, and the products that they were creating to create an open society and support that would be misused, and in multiple very ingenious ways. One would be just gaining information on people, because for the longest time there was this service called, if you had an email, you could also have like a public profile. I forget what it was called, but it was like essentially Google's version of a social media platform. But what was being discovered is that it was being misused by bad actors to gain information on people. So they eventually did away with that service. The same thing happened with Google Voice. You know, they wanted to get into the telecom business, and they were to an extent, but they ended up finding that the service was being misused by and large by bad actors. So,
like for instance, like I told you, you haven't seen it, but I've seen many YouTube commercials where AI Trump, and AI Jordan Peterson, and AI other people are selling products. Okay? Now, when the person made voice cloning abilities, right, or image cloning abilities or creation abilities, they did not intend for it to be used for this purpose. But obviously someone figured, oh yeah, I can use it to mislead people to be interested in a product. Right? But how... You can't prevent that. Yeah. I don't know how you can prevent that.
Yeah.
So what? So then nobody can use the software?
That's the thing. Yeah.
You still have to...
So in my experience, and I want to get back to your point in a second, and help me get there, because it's going to be about ads. So just bring up that word when I forget what I was going to go back to. But yeah, so and from what my experience, and from the experience, from the perspective of those in power, the best solution to a problem is to get rid of what's causing the problem, or to manage it so much so that it's not creating the problem, but it's also not useful. And you can't have a society like that. You can't have an economy like that. A capitalist society survives off of things being created and consumed by people. Now, is it perfect? No. But what is better than that? Nothing. And we lack both the technology and the evolution.
It's a constant balancing and rebalancing of safety and risk.
Yeah,
you can't go full risk because it's going to cause too much damage. You can't go to so much safety that there's no more improvement, no expansion, right? So there has to be a continuing, you're never going to reach balance, but a continuing striving to balance out.
Well, yes. So I would agree with you that I think that's what exists right now in our society. But I think the free enterprise that is hindered, it's not free enterprise. It ceases to be free enterprise. It becomes a managed democracy, a managed economy, which is basically a hybrid of what China has. Now that's worked for China, but China has a communist government. They don't have the freedoms that we have here. They don't have freedom of speech. You can't go to Tiananmen Square and protest. What happened there was a massacre of students. Even to this day, going to Tiananmen Square and conducting a protest will get you kicked, will get you jailed, arrested, jailed, and if you're a foreign visitor, kicked out of the country, never to return. And if you're a local, I mean, you could go to jail for like a really long time. So when you juxtapose these two societies, it's completely different. So our economy can't function that way. So that's why, and AI it's no different. AI is a new technology. So I would almost equate it to like firearms. It's a right by law. Now that right can be taken away from you. But there's also an industry that exists around gun manufacturing. Now they take a lot of flack whenever there's a school shooting or something else that happens, but I mean, yes, it sucks. This is the cost of doing business. That's what I'm trying to get to, is it's the cost of doing business. And AI is one of those technologies as well that it's not enshrined in the Constitution as a right. So it's a privilege to be able to use it. You have to pay to use it. But
I got a good example. So when we first saw the first mock-up of the Cybertruck, it had no side mirrors, no rear view mirror, right? But eventually when it comes out, it has those. Why? Because there's certain basic safety stuff. You can't control everything when you're driving, but you've got to have these things because you need it for safety, right? So there are certain things you have to have, but they know that this isn't going to prevent all accidents. This isn't going to prevent every crash into a wall or whatever, but it's doing your due diligence.
There will likely be seatbelt laws, is what
that's another one.
Is what I'll call them for AI. So there will be laws that exist that clearly spell out the rules of the road for AI. But I don't.
That doesn't mean people won't find a way to bend it, though.
Yes, and that's what I think. That's the difference in the parties. You see one that's like they censure free speech, they bully technology companies to act in a certain way that is conducive and beneficial for their administration over others. What you also see a lot of is, and I think for the longest time, it was difficult to kind of accept this, but there is really a focus on minimizing the speech of conservatives. So I think that's how that plays out with AI. I think because it's an individual use, it's not that you can't kind of conflate it in the same sense of as being like a social media platform, but its utilization is, I think, it's going to be difficult to see how it's able to iterate if there's too many guardrails put on. And I think that's the concern, is when one administration comes in, they're going to want this set of things. And you see this all the time. Banks will say, oh, okay, we're going to remove the penalty for late fees. There's some subservience or there's some placation of the new administration that's coming in so that they don't get overly burdened by regulation. And I think it's not going to be any different for AI companies. And that's unfortunate, because I think that the answers to very difficult technology questions can only really be reached if you have an unrestricted AI model that's able to support you.
The power will never be realized completely with these rules on it. But the thing is, some country might not have those rules, and then they will. They hype it up a lot. We don't know, but if AI becomes as integral and important as people think it's going to be, then being behind on it for your country is going to be very bad.
Well, and this brings us full circle. You know, the point I was going to bring up before was regarding ads. I think advertisements or advertisements have become so polished with recommending products that you might be interested in. I was talking to somebody recently about this and how I had a project that I was working on. It's a personal project. It was gardening. And I was trying to get all of the pieces that I needed to get my garden set up. And I found the pots that I needed. They're the right size. They're bigger. And then I found the trays that I needed. They were the right size to accommodate the base dimensions of the pot. And then I realized, well, I could also get a pot trolley. So you could put, if it's a bigger pot, you can put it on like a wheeled base. And I had never even thought of that. But then as I was doing research for other parts of this effort, I found these trolleys. I was like, well, that actually might be pretty good. And that hit me. I was like, oh, damn. That's the AI recommendation service that's really driving home the desire to purchase. Now, you take that example and you apply it to other countries who aren't putting these restrictions on their AI models. Yeah, I mean, in some cases, you could see a situation arise where we're losing the AI supremacy. In some cases, I think that the technology industrial complexes shift towards the Trump administration has a lot to do with that. It's no longer just competition between companies. It's competition between companies, economies, countries, of course, but also the future of what the world is going to look like. When you paint the competition in those terms, it's pretty stark. Like, the stakes are really high, and you can't afford to lose. So that pivot away from one party versus the other, it could be strategic. And I think it will be consequential. How consequential remains to be seen, but...
For what else you got on it?
All right, well...
was that it for the Prof G video?
No.
Well, keep going on that one.
So, I forget the point that I was driving towards here, but there was a moment in the episode where he's imagining Elon giving directions, I guess either as president or...
Dictator?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that?
No.
Okay, so we'll move on.
Well, you don't remember it either?
Well, I don't want to misremember. But there was this moment in the podcast where he was asked by the host, Professor G was asked by the host, Karen Swisher.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was asked, there's this game, make love to Mary and someone, and he chose to, like, his response.
Oh yes, and he said he was gonna rub himself up with oil and jump in a tub with Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, gonna toss him around.
Yeah, but what did he say about Elon? I didn't get that point of it. I didn't understand what the angle was either. But I don't remember what did he say about Elon.
I
remember he said like Bezos first and then Zuckerberg, but then what did he say about you can't kiss Elon?
It was just really weird. It was a really weird turn to that, and I was like, I just wanted to talk about it because it's like, you know, this is the thinking on the left, right? This is the thinking that they come to. Like, how can
it was a non-answer to the question.
Yeah, all right, we're gonna move on because I was just like, that was really weird. So he did make a good point, I thought, about, you know, Amazon investors seeing and thinking that Amazon's really a cloud company with a retail unit.
I don't think so. I think investors now consider Amazon as essentially a cloud company with a retail unit, and their cloud division actually missed estimates by about $100 million. And even though the growth was 19% to $29 billion, keep in mind that while AWS represents just 15% of Amazon's revenue, it's responsible for the majority of its operating profit. So as AWS goes now,
CEO so Andy Jassy used to run. Used to run before.
And is the reason he's the CEO.
Yeah.
Because essentially, as AWS goes, so does Amazon now. And so the analysts and shareholders are essentially, yeah, retail, fine, Amazon Prime Video, yeah, whatever, what's happening with AWS. I initially thought that, I've said this in my prediction set 2 or 3 years ago, that Amazon would eventually spend AWS, and AWS would be the most valuable company in the world.
I thought that was fascinating. I'm going to drop some numbers on you here. So apparently the cloud division missed estimates by $100 million. Okay. Growth was 19%, which is equivalent to $29 billion.
Whoa.
AWS represents 15% of revenue.
Whoa.
Generates most of the operating profit for Amazon. And this is apparently what led to Jassy becoming the new CEO of Amazon. So AWS was 19% of growth. It was $29 billion, but it only represents 15% of revenue. So in my head, I make a pie and I'm like, okay, how does AWS represent 15%? And then I realized it's a slim pie. They're not equal portions. So AWS represents a significant portion of Amazon's profit, 15%. And apparently other business is just divided accordingly, but not in regards to the same amount. So AWS represents a significant amount of Amazon profit, but they missed. So anyway, the point is that they represent a significant portion, and that's AWS. And the reason I bring this up is to just drive home again the point that AI is pretty much going to be the focus for a lot of these tech companies into the future. So
look at NVIDIA stock.
Yeah.
Who do you think's buying all those?
Well, I don't know.
Amazon, Facebook, what's the other one? I'm sure Twitter and all that stuff. They're all setting up their own AI services. They need all those chips.
So, and they need the space they need the locations, the AI data centers to support it.
Yeah. And what are you going to put in there? Racks and racks and racks and racks of NVIDIA chips.
Yeah. In New Albany, Ohio, I did some research on this recently. I heard this on a Marketplace podcast. Don't ask me which because I listen to too many. But in New Albany, Ohio, there's been like a lease of 1,000 acres of land set aside for Intel data center, Microsoft data center, Facebook data center, Google data center. I already mentioned Microsoft, but I'm sure there's others that are coming in there into this area in Ohio, and they're just buying up land so that they can create data centers, and likely what's going to end up happening is these data centers are going to be supporting their AI models. Discuss. Or your thoughts?
I believe it. I mean, that makes sense. I'm sure Ohio land is cheap. I bet the weather there is good because I know data centers is cheaper to pull cold air out of the surrounding environment. So I think, if I remember right, Ohio could get pretty cold.
Yeah, maybe instead of heating the facilities, they just let some natural cooling to occur.
Yeah, it's cheaper.
So you could save on energy costs. Yeah. But wouldn't that be an interesting location for a modular nuclear reactor?
Oh, yeah.
Perfect location, right?
Yeah.
You could have one modular nuclear reactor powering multiple data centers. Who knows how many?
Yeah, that'd be a good model. So I know that's what they're working towards, because all these tech companies know that the amount of energy they need for what they want to do, we don't have it.
Uh-huh.
So we either have to build a whole bunch of coal plants, which people don't want, or nuclear plants, which people don't want, but it is green.
Yeah.
So you have to make a choice.
Coal plants, I think, is unrealistic because it has to be fueled by more coal. I think nuclear can it's a little bit different, but the modular is even more appealing.
Yeah.
Easier to secure if you take the right precautions, and you can pick it up and move it. You can decommission it safer, and you can stand it up quicker. So the costs to stand up and stand down are significantly less than managing a long-standing nuclear reactor, which is different as well.
If it makes excess energy, I guess you could sell that to the population that's near the centers.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I think
overall it's a good idea if people can get behind it.
I mean, yeah, and for me, and just sharing all this with you, my insight is that the future is going to be AI, and that there's and I think the reason being is because tech companies see that there's a value add to some product that they're working on. I know with Facebook, they're focused on a heads-up display that you can utilize via some glasses, and that's what they really want to focus on. And kudos to Mark Zuckerberg for focusing on that, because in my opinion, I really feel like he has the right attitude to be CEO of a tech company. He's not really in it for the power. He appreciates the benefits of being the CEO, but he really just wants to create things. And I wholeheartedly can sympathize with that perspective. It's not, he just wants to create things that people can use and derive usefulness from and will benefit their lives or improve and enhance their lives and give them more opportunities to spend and create moments with the people they love. That's to me, that's his whole ethos. And obviously I'm not naive, there's other less altruistic reasons that kind of motivate him. But
do you feel that's still one of his main motivations?
I do, and I think he believes it genuinely. If you compare like others, like Elon, there's a
megalomania.
Yeah, there's an ego to doing the things he's doing, and in some cases he may have lost the thread in terms of understanding what it is he's trying to do. But he just perhaps realizes, like, in order to do X, which may be go to Mars, he has to support Donald Trump and clean up the government, and then in return, perhaps the president assists him with a moon base, assists him with securing the funding for the next 10 years to create the infrastructure or just work towards going to Mars.
So, to wrap it up, AI is important.
I mean, I think AI is going to be the future. We've seen a lot of different...
And we can't put too many guardrails on it, otherwise we're going to lose to other countries who don't put those guardrails on it. And if it is as important to the future as we think it will be, then that will very much cripple America in the long run.
It'll hinder American innovation, it'll stifle competition, and ultimately competition is what really keeps America in the forefront in terms of supremacy of technology, militarily, just in general, leading the world when it comes to the economy. These are drivers of the economy, one of many.
Yep, I agree. All right, some other topics you wanted to cover on that pivot episode? Go ahead.
So they mentioned briefly government intervention. So I guess Professor Galloway's position on government intervention was that sometimes the government needs to get involved, sometimes, and I think he generally advocated for the fact that government involvement is a net good thing, but a net good thing in comparison to what? If you believe, for instance, certain types of free speech can be considered hate speech or can be considered violence, then perhaps you're okay with thinking that government intervention, censoring or encouraging technology companies to censor account holders on the platform is a good thing, then you're likely going to be an individual who's like, well, yeah, that's good government intervention. But I think that's a slippery slope. And I think that gets into another topic I want to get into. But before I do that, did you have anything you wanted to say on that?
Mm-mm.
Okay. All right, so one point that really got my attention was his position on government service. It's very interesting. I think both sides typically believe that government service is a good thing. However, they each view it wildly differently. Professor G would have us believe that government service is a good thing and that we should always be deferential to our public servants and those who serve in the military, but it's a rabbit hole without end. That deference exists ad infinitum, but there has to be some limit to that. You can't just continuously
assume that everybody doing their job in the government is doing a good job.
Right.
There's nobody being lazy.
There's no fraud, waste, and abuse.
Yeah.
And I think that's typically the way individuals on the left view government when it's their team in control of government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a problem, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree. They think there's these passionate people who just want to serve the American people. Mm-hmm. And they go in and they're not worried about their pay. They're not worried about their insurance.
They're worried now.
They're there to serve. And that's their main goal. Yeah. And they go in there and they give 110% every day to make sure they're doing the best for American people.
Yep.
That's not real life.
But
man.
They're worried now.
I know, but what I'm saying is they don't go to their jobs like that.
Yeah, I know.
They go, oh shit, I gotta go to work today. You know, I don't really feel like going. Maybe I'll just call out. I mean, they're regular people.
Right.
This idea
They're
that they
infallible.
come in there like, for America.
Yeah.
I mean, some are, right? But the vast majority, this is their 9 to 5. They see screwed up crap going on all day, just like any job. You see the screwed up stuff that happens.
Like
Ain't your business.
Yeah.
You move on.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what's really going on. But yeah, you're right. They have a vision of them in their mind. Like these great, sacrificial, humble patriots that go to work every day with the only goal is to improve the lives of Americans. No.
Well, I think there are those who believe that they're improving the lives of their fellow Americans, and they believe it so much so that they're willing to publicly say so. During reduction in force, I mean, there's always going to be this vociferous response to individuals who are losing their employment, and because they feel wronged and that they feel that they've been harmed by an administration that is not only hurting them, but by proxy hurting the American people. And I think his point on the service to country, it was interesting because he feels as if everybody should have the opportunity to serve. But I was wondering, has he served? Like, did he serve in the military? Has he ever been, like, worked in the federal government?
I don't know.
Because I also hear this a lot from people. They have a position, but they have no experience. They know because somebody else knows, right? Which is not that type of empirical data. It's often skewed. And as a professor, I thought it was very odd that he was just so blindly believing that government service is this calling. And it is in some cases, but by and large, it's not. I mean, a lot of people in government, they struggle to make ends meet. They want a commitment, not a resume. You do have to sacrifice a lot. In some cases, you have to sacrifice your family to support the mission. And you have to sacrifice your career goals because you're serving a higher calling and a higher purpose. So it's not as if, it kind of seems like he's talking out both sides of his mouth. He doesn't really understand what government service is, but the idea of it is noble and just, and we should respect those people who are doing it. And I don't think that. I think it's applied too broadly. His thinking.
I think there are definitely people out there who have a patriotic spirit and they want to go out and serve their country. I definitely believe those people exist.
Sure.
Good for them, right? But I do not generalize that to everybody in government. I think it's a small, maybe a large, but a smaller group of people. The vast majority of them are not like that. This is a 9 to 5. I do this to get a paycheck.
Right. A secure, a consistent paycheck.
Yeah.
And the second Trump administration has been norm busting because usually there's a lot of individuals whom as public servants they serve. Perhaps they came in during one administration and then they're able to continue on in another administration. So if they came in during Republican, they ride out a Democratic administration and then vice versa. So that doesn't create any issues. But what's so interesting about this second go around of the Trump administration is that they're busting all those norms and they're saying, no, we're not going to follow the old playbook. We have a mandate from the American people. It was the will of the American people that we institute change, and that's what we're going to do. And it will be even more interesting to see how much pain they're willing to accept before they change course or decide, you know what, we're not changing course. The pain is necessary. It's going to be very painful, and this is the course we've chosen. So he also made some comments about the Iron Throne benefit. I think he was making a reference to like Game of Thrones by saying that. I think what he was doing was calling President Trump a king. This is Professor Galloway was calling President Trump a king and saying that he has the benefit of the Iron Throne to be able to do whatever he wants in the Seven Kingdoms. and I guess the Seven Kingdoms would be analogous to the federal government. So, I mean, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that. I just thought
I didn't watch the show, so I can't really tell you.
Oh, I thought it was funny.
No, I get what he's saying, though. Yeah.
Okay. He also mentioned that I guess this is it's kind of strange that there's a convicted felon that can be president.
That's what they wanted. He didn't go to jail for it, but man, they got that label stuck on him.
Yeah.
So now they can use it every time. You say President Trump, I say felon Trump.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a title that doesn't mean anything. It's just like when people are called like cyber czar, it doesn't mean anything.
But it feels good to say it.
It's like
feels good.
You remember that there's this episode in Seinfeld where the postmaster general found Kramer, and Kramer's like brought into this room with a hot lamp. He's being interrogated by the postmaster general. And it's the title. It's an empty title if you allow it to be.
It's what they wanted, and I remember at the time people were posting AI pictures of Trump in the orange jumper behind bars, right? And that's what they wanted, right?
Yeah, they were trying to manifest that destiny, weren't they?
Was just like you said, a hollow word, and that's all they have left. So the vision of him behind bars has been dwindled down to, well, we got fraud, we got a felon. I mean, that's what we got, right? So that's what they got. So that's what they use.
Yeah, it is when you tap into this thinking. It's just like how can you can't win elections with this thinking. This is what's so kind of unnerving. Is like Democrats, they used to be for the working man, and now it's almost like flipped in that Republicans, and I've seen this for years, especially years ago I saw this, that Republicans definitely they've always been focused on businesses and businessmen, but they also respected individual rights. And I mean, that's what this last election really was about. It was a referendum on freedoms and liberties, business, the pursuance of business, which also could be considered equivalent to independence and freedom. And I mean, the country spoke. There was another comment he made about Democrats built Tesla, and now it seems as if,
I don't remember. He said that?
Yeah. He said Democrats, they built Tesla, and I think there's some.
I mean, there is a lot of truth in that.
Because that's the perception.
That's the people he was playing to.
Yeah, it's the perception, because they're the ones who bought the cars.
Yeah.
He went on to say that basically Elon is illegally hacking our government without legit oversight, and this is just another thing that I think I hear a lot from the left, is like there needs to be oversight. This is what they don't understand, man. Oversight is important, but certain types of oversight, right? The Dodd-Frank Act, that's financial law that was instituted primarily because there were instances of foreign powers manipulating certain elements of the financial industry, and they were making such twists in the financial dealings of certain aspects of business here in America that it became so much of an issue. It was so overwhelming that they had to pass law to stop this from continuing to occur. That hasn't really gone anywhere, and that was a bipartisan piece of legislation that still exists today. I think there's certain types of legislation that that rises to the occasion as being so onerous that you have to do something about it, because look at the harms that it's causing. And it's not just one or two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. It's like tens, it's hundreds, it's thousands. And that's when some parties like, well, okay, now we have to do something about this. The harm was, if it was isolated and concentrated to just like a small group of people, then you kind of want to let the industry figure that out. But if it gets to the point where now it's having this national impact, we have to do something about that. And I think unfortunately, that seems to be a point that is lost consistently with Democrat elected representatives. They just don't seem to understand. They think that one harm is equivalent to thousands of harms.
Yeah.
But in fact, the opposite, the logic is not true. So anyway, did you want to say anything about Tesla?
Now is his time to push to the right. He's got all the liberal sales in. Now to get all the right sales in. and then I'm not sure what he does after that.
So okay, this is we'll extend that point a little bit further. There's been discussion that companies are considering, companies like Microsoft and I forget, there are companies that are interested in purchasing TikTok. So I wouldn't be surprised, and this is a good point that Professor G made, we're entering a merger and acquisition climate. I think that's very true. Republican president, business-friendly ally in the White House, you're going to see more mergers and acquisitions, more opportunities to make money, expand the economy, etc., etc., etc. Any thoughts on who buys TikTok?
I just told you the one I heard people want to buy it, but the one I thought was a good idea was that Mr. Beast, with the backing of different people who have AI models they want to use to get it, which I think that makes a lot of sense. Because he could promote it, he could start releasing content on it. He already has a library of content, I'm sure he could shift it over. If we get people to be excited about it. I think he's the type of person who could raise that kind of money. Because not everybody can raise, I don't know how many billions it's going to be, but there's only a few amount of people in the world who can even raise that kind of money.
Well, I mean, recently Elon basically sent an offer to CEO of ChatGPT to purchase it.
Yeah, I know, but I think that was just to mess with it. Because they were going through a deal. I think it was valued at 40-something billion. And then he came in with an offer of 90-something billion when they were close to, I think, finishing it up to throw a muck into it. Because I agree with people, there is animosity between Elon Musk and Sam Altman.
Yeah.
So I think that was a play to screw up the deal, and now they got to go over it again.
So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if there's any additional merger and acquisitions that come out. I wouldn't be surprised not to find some. I mean, it's too early. It's too early in the Trump administration to determine whether or not some acquisitions are going to be allowed to go through and others are not. I think there's still too much upheaval in like the FCC, SEC. So we'll see how that goes. So now the last topic, the thinking that exists on the left. It's just like how they get to these places. It's so bizarre to me. Like they get from talking about, and at the top of the podcast, they were talking about how they're being attacked by billionaires. But then at the end of the podcast, the episode, with talking about having sex with each other. And it just kind of shows you like the range that people on the left have with where they start and then where they end up with their beliefs and the things that they're talking about and the things that they're doing. It's as almost like they vomit their ideas onto this canvas and they look at it and they're like, oh, this is interesting. And then they make a connection to some other piece of vomit splatter and say, oh, this is interesting. Let's talk about this. And then that becomes like, I don't know, gender ideology. And they're just like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. That's great vomit splatter. Let's
White Z,
advance this.
You are describing our podcast. And I want you to know that you didn't even have the self-insight to see that. We also aspire to throw up whatever's on our mind. And we also aspire to go from talking about moon landings to making cheese, okay? We aspire to go across many a topic in a non-linear way.
But we don't talk about having sex with each other.
That is a future episode. So we'll close that section off there.
I knew something wasn't right with Michael, and I would have to check on him constantly. There was one incident back in March of last year where I couldn't get a hold of him. So I called his buddy Nick, and Nick went over to his house. He looked in the window, and he sees Michael on the floor. And he broke in and calls an ambulance and takes him to the hospital. And he goes into ICU for 4 days on an overdose. His arm was fucked up because he had been laying on it. And Nick basically saved his life that day. And every day after that, and even before that, I would check on Michael just to check on him. In May, he crashed his car. We got him a new car. In June, he crashed his car again. I let him use my car. In November, he crashed my car and then overdosed. So what happened was, on the November 16th, we filmed an episode, and he was a little messed up, and he posted one of the videos. You could tell he's messed up. You know, and he would always tell me, I'm not using, but he was on Suboxone, right? And he said, this is just an effect of Suboxone, which was bullshit. You know, he was buying all this drugs on the dark web and having cocaine and whatever else they put in it shipped to his house. And then he was on muscle relaxers that he got from India. He was on this, he was on that. And I couldn't control it. And so, but I would always check on it. You know, Michael, how are you doing? If I couldn't check on him, or if I couldn't hear back, then I knew something was wrong. And on the 16th, I went over to his house and I checked on him, and he seemed fine. And then I left. And then the next morning, you know, I said, Michael, and he wouldn't respond. I went over to his house. We got a locksmith, and I found him on the bathroom floor with face down, lighter in his hand, purple face because all the blood was rushed to his face. His nose was white, dead. My son, my pride and joy, and now my memory, and I'm just so grateful that he was in my life as long as I got to be with him.
All right, me and White Z just watched the most recent Bruce Rivers show where he talks about the death of his son. And I thought there was 3 main things that I got from it. First off, that how good of an example of a father Bruce portrayed and how important I think that is. And then the struggles and problems with drug abuse. And then lastly, that social media's reaction to it, the negative feedback that he got after posting his video. So, first off, I remember something that I saw long time ago when I was working at a store, and I remember seeing a guy who would shop there frequently, and he would come there with his daughter in his cart, and they were playing with each other and laughing with each other all the time. And I always thought to myself, wow, you know, the world needs this type of father-child relationship that I don't see much from my own perspective. So growing up, I don't know my real dad. Most of my friends don't know their real dad. And I don't think this was a problem even, 40, 50 years ago on a majority. And so it was rare for me to see in real life a father being a father to his child in a healthy way. And when I first started watching Bruce Rivers, if you've watched the show, you never saw his son in the background. You knew he was back there, and maybe sometimes you'd hear him speak, but it was mostly just Bruce Rivers. But then more recently, his son started getting into the cuts and talking on the mic, and I thought it was such a good show. Not only his content's good, but the back and forth and relationship between him and his son. And you could just tell how much he cared about his son, how much his son cared about him, and just having that interaction as an example to other people on the internet, I thought was important. It's really sad that his son died, but I definitely appreciated the show, not only for the regular content that he'd make, but for that aspect of it. The second thing is the drug abuse. Also growing up, there's many people that I knew who took drugs through high school. I have family members who were addicted to drugs. I've dated people who were addicted to drugs. And it's just such a horrible thing that you can't help them. The only way they can get help is if they themselves internally finally had enough, and they finally find the strength within themselves to break the cycle of drug addiction and the helplessness that you feel that you can't help them. They put you in a cycle where they say, I want help. You try to help them. They seem to be doing better, only for them to drop back into it. then, like he says, if you watch the show, deny that they're doing it, and it's completely obvious that they're doing it due to health issues or just how sickly and tired they look. And it's just such a terrible issue that exists a lot, especially nowadays. You know, a lot of people are addicted to fentanyl and stuff, that you can see somebody, especially your own child, wasting away, killing themselves, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And that leads to the third thing, is the people online who are going to say, like, oh, he's not a good father, he didn't pay enough attention to his son, you know, there's something wrong with him. But it's complete bullcrap. For one, who are these, like, how would you walk up to a man who just lost his child and talk trash to his face? I mean, I hope not, because whatever you got going to you, you would deserve. But also, it's so heartless, you know? And the way that people can interact with each other in a heartless way online, I think that's a super unhealthy effect that social media is having on people. Because we aren't meant to communicate behind avatars, behind pictures, at a great distance, that we lose that there's humanity on the other side, that there's a real person on the other side, and we say things in a flippant way that are, it's a terrible, unfortunate, a great negative on modern society. But anyways, that's what I wanted to say mostly about it. What you got?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's sad. I mean, we've been here before. It's, despite, you know, his situation. I mean, and this is kind of like hollow comfort for some people, but it was actually worse decades ago. I remember growing up where I remember growing up where people were afraid to just go out into the streets, just to, like, take their garbage to the curb, because that's how bad. There was a drug epidemic decades ago that people just, they didn't want to go into the streets. They didn't want to go outside because they were afraid they were going to get shot or mugged or something else. And so I think that the country goes through these cycles from time to time, and understanding the origins is important. Fentanyl crisis is not something that is organic. It is something that is being pushed upon us by foreign countries. And I know how you feel about the global war on drugs, or the drug war, but I have said time and again, it is the only global war that is justified in terms of spending money on, in terms of supporting, in terms of destroying. It is the one war that is the least popular war in this country, but it is the war that should be fought. And the reason why is because of the lives that these drugs are able to affect. And if you can't stop the flow of drugs into this country, if you can't get to the root source, and you know, this new administration, I am buoyed by the fact that they're taking such a harsh stance. I've told you in private how I feel about certain drug organizations, and how for the longest time there has not been a president who has been willing to take a tougher stance on these drug organizations. Everything, with certain exceptions, I would say, that I've told you, were I king for a day, how I would handle them, is more or less exactly what this president is doing. I am hopeful that with a bold man, bold action will be taken to address this at the root cause. And I think it's going to have a positive impact on the country for the next 4 years. What happens after those 4 years is going to be obviously anyone's guess. Maybe the policies of this administration are continued. Maybe certain elements of the administration's policies are continued. Who knows? But it goes without saying that drugs have a terrible effect. It's easy to become addicted, even to like legal drugs. Alcohol is addicting. Pharmaceuticals can be addicting or addictive, and it has a negative effect.
I'll just take you already know where I'm coming from, but for me, there's no way to get drugs out of society. I feel like if you look into history of drugs, almost every culture used drugs. They'll never go away. The best thing you can do is legalize it and regulate it. We don't know, but it's very possible that his son died because he thought he was taking a certain amount of dosage, but because it comes from the dark web, it has stuff in there that he doesn't even know, and so he takes too much and he dies. So the problem is, it's many factors, but I think that is the only solution, is to legalize it and regulate it. But yeah, I know most people don't agree with me.
Well,
but what do you think about
legalization?
No,
decriminalization?
No, about the other point about people online saying, "Oh, you could have done more for your son. You're a bad father." I don't know, just come out harshly against somebody that they don't even know really online. To feel like not only that you need, like, it's one thing to even say it to yourself, right? But why do you have to reach out to someone and say, "Hey, you're a bad dad. Hey, your son died because of you"? I mean, isn't this unnecessary?
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the legalization. I think it depends. Like, there are certain drugs like marijuana that probably could be legalized, and then the black market value of that product diminishes because now it's legalized. There will always be a black market variant that exists because it's more powerful than the legal version that you can get, and it's going to provide more of a high. But I think just simply legalizing that, which I think would have a much greater impact on its black market wholesale value, would make a big difference. But when it comes to like pharmaceutical drugs, manufactured drugs like meth, fentanyl, carfentanil, these are manufactured drugs. They're not just grown like cocaine. The reason why it's so powerful is because it's cut with other pharmaceuticals to make it more powerful, but by itself it's still pretty powerful. But that's still, now if we talk about marijuana, you can't talk about marijuana in the same sense that you can talk about cocaine. Cocaine is such a powerful drug, and if we're talking about cocaine, we would be remiss to not talk about scopolamine, which has an even more of an impact on individuals who it's administered to. These are all natural drugs, though, so they're grown, they're processed, and then they're presented to clients who purchase them and then they use them. But the difference between those category of drugs, which are natural, and your fentanyl, carfentanil, meth, is that there's so much more chemicals that are put into it to cut it and manufacture it. So this is the reason why there's like Schedule 1, Schedule 2, and there's different types of drugs. I think that you have to look at the totality of the drugs that we're talking about legalizing. Portugal has done this. Spain has done this, where they've legalized certain types of drugs. And what they find is that, yeah, it may cut down on certain types of crimes, but it creates other types of crimes elsewhere. So you cut your nose to spite your face, I guess is the saying, or the phrase, and it's naive to think that we can deregulate our way out of this, but I don't think that's true.
I think with the creation of fentanyl, it's basically impossible because, as far as I know, a ball of fentanyl like the size of a softball is enough to get like everybody in Texas high. How can you stop that? How can you build a fence to stop that? You're not stopping a pallet of drugs. You're not stopping a truck of drugs. You're gonna stop a softball somebody could toss over that can be split up and get an entire state high. It's not possible anymore.
The only way that you combat that type of trafficking is we have to have a whole of government, whole of society approach, but mostly a whole of government approach. Because I think societally, most people will admit that drugs are bad, okay, but they disagree on how we deal with the problem. Like, you have a very unique position I would say my position is you can't deregulate your way out of it. You can't legalize your way out of it.
If we're talking, will agree, yeah.
If we're talking about those hard-hitting drugs. And so I think my position is even more unique in that it's probably more libertarian. I think that if we're talking about certain wings of the Republican Party, their position is going to be pretty standard across the board societally, which is you have to get at the source, which is the organizations that are trafficking in these drugs. So, unfortunately, like I said, I don't think you can deregulate your way out of it. So the question is, what do you do to deal with the problem? And I think...
Hold on. As far as I know, what I've heard is that the compounds for fentanyl are produced in China, shipped to Mexico, where they are refined and mixed or whatever into the final product, and then obviously shipped across the border into America.
Yeah.
So
that's what I've heard and read.
What are you gonna do?
Okay, so we have to equate the war on drugs, like I've said already, is a legitimate war. It needs to be given more credibility. It needs to be supported. I'm not saying you do that through the DEA. I think that the DEA is not really capable of combating this. They're very reactive to this, and they only have domestic authorities to deal with this, and so that doesn't do anything. That reaction to something that's coming into the country, that puts us back. It just keeps us doing what we've been doing, which is reacting to the flow. So transnational narco trafficking has to be equivalent to terrorism. We have to start thinking about it in our country as just as dangerous, if not more so, because of the surreptitious ways that it infiltrates and inculcates into our society, into our country. We have to consider it more nefarious than terrorism. Terrorism, I think, because of the loss of freedoms that we've had to sacrifice in order to combat terrorism, that I can't remember the last time there was a terrorist attack. I think there was a truck driving incident in Louisiana not too long ago. But I mean, that aside, besides that, when's the last time it's hard to summon an example. So that I think we have a handle on here on the homeland. When it comes to drugs, we have to equate it in the same sense and breath that we equate terrorism. And so, again, I'm buoyed by the fact that this administration is taking such a harder stance on transnational narco trafficking. And in some cases, you could consider it to be a form of terrorism. Narco-terrorism is a term that I've heard and read in regards to the trafficking of this type of a drug. And the reason why is because, like you said, it doesn't take much to kill a lot of people if it's put into like a water supply, or there's some super spreader that multiplies the individuals that the drug is able to touch. Like maybe if it's created as an aerosol and put into, like, say, a hospital, as an example, it could.
You're
just
saying
coming
it has
into contact
potential
with it
as a weapon,
as a bioweapon.
But I don't think you even need to go that far with it. I forget how many people die a year from drug overdoses. I think in the hundreds of thousands.
A harder stance has to be taken in terms of how.
Okay, so what do you want the government to
So
do?
the
bomb China?
Well, so I think the response that they're going to take in dealing with this is just at our southern border, and my suspicion is that there's going to be a lot of late night operations into these facilities all across Mexico that are manufacturing, storing, trafficking, and essentially engaging in the sale of this product. And I think that's one way to deal with it. And I think, unfortunately, that's probably the best way to deal with it, short of coming into conflict with China. And I don't think anybody wants to see that in terms of military technology. There's an imbalance in terms of military.
We've seen those pictures
technology
where the cartels across the border have modern Humvees.
Yeah.
They've got modern weapons, camouflage, probably some modern training.
The tools that exist for national security, they have been traditionally and historically focused on terrorism. Those tools need to be redirected to address this problem, which is fentanyl trafficking.
Hey, listen, I would be all for that in the sense that I think terrorism is a vague, unwinnable goal. What does it mean to defeat
fighting an
terrorism?
ideology. It's an ideology.
You can
you're
fight
fighting
a cartel.
Yeah.
You can beat a cartel.
There are people who are moving tangible product.
Yeah.
You can't defeat an idea by bombing it into submission.
Yeah. How are you going to bomb terrorism? The idea of terrorism is not possible.
No.
But if you say this group in this area, we're going to take them out, there's a point where you've won. Where I think fighting terrorism, there is no winning point.
Yeah. There's always the Faustinian, the deal with the devil, because this happened with Pablo Escobar. He got so big as a narco trafficker that he essentially was able to bully the Colombian government into building a prison that he paid for, that he would stay in, to satisfy politicians and Americans who were concerned about Colombia falling into a narco state, becoming a narco state. And the prospect of that is the implications of what that means. A lot of people, I don't think they can really, but imagine a drug lord who has his own air force, or a drug lord who has his own special forces, and a drug lord who has access to military grade weapons. Well,
technically they're going to have it because they are crafty and ingenuitive people in the sense that they're going to adopt drones. They're going to adopt drone subs, drone boats, and they'll have the money to fund it.
Well,
and then what do we do when they have an actual army?
And so the concern too that has existed for the longest period of time is that in regards to the trafficking of these hard-hitting drugs in Mexico, is that the federales, the Mexican federal government, they know this occurs and they do nothing. They have essentially an agreement with the cartels that allows them to do business so long as they keep the death count to a minimum. They keep disruption to society to a minimum. They're not challenging the authority of the federal government. They're basically, and when they're told to do something, they respond and they do it. And sometimes you've seen flare-ups of this as a fallout of with recent arrests with the Sinaloa cartel. They resented the control that the federales were trying to place on them, and so they go off and do their own thing, and then it ends with one of them being extradited to the United States. So you see cycles of this, but I don't know that the Mexican government is strong enough and independent enough to combat this on their own, and that creates a very difficult problem domestically for the United States, where previous administrations they didn't have, I would just say, not courage, it's just they didn't have the commitment to deal with it in the manner that I think the current administration does. And it's a unique situation for the current administration because this is his second term. He's already a lame duck going in, but he has a mandate. And so bold action is going to be taken because what comes after this second term is retirement. So why not? This is your last hurrah. Do it. Take the bold action, and then see if your successors decide to continue the policies that you've put in place to keep the country safe and secure from this type of drug entering the country. And it's a big deal. I think this ties into your point about the social media reaction. So the thing that I would caution you with is to not go down this path of thinking these are real people. They could be, but it's almost better to assume that they're not, or that there's some malicious actor.
Listen, in this case, we're talking about Bruce Rivers. Okay? He has a large fan base. A lot of people watching him. The chances that it's some outside actor doing this for some reason that's not comprehensible, I don't think so. Most of the people criticizing him are real people. The thing is, they've been desensitized. They don't have the person in front of them, looking them in the eyes, the body language, everything, to tell them, to trigger in them that, oh, this is a human, to trigger the empathy, to say, like, they wouldn't say that to him in real life. You know what I'm saying? But suddenly you come online, your empathy goes, it's like you just become disconnected from whatever's on the other side of what you're saying. You're disconnected from it. and I think it allows you to be much more crueler than you would be if that situation was going on close to you in the flesh.
Look, I'm not disagreeing that some people do this. We don't know what's going on in their lives. I mean, obviously, capitalism can have a very deleterious effect on people's mental state. I mean, again, we've gone through rounds of this in this country where when people are let go or fired from a job, it increases stress. It leads to divorce. It leads to families breaking up. Your finances are in free fall. You go further into debt. I mean, there's a domino effect that is specifically related to someone losing their job and then losing their home. And then it spirals out of control from there. And then drug addiction comes in, because how else do people cope? Studies have shown that in hyper-competitive markets and hyper-competitive economies, drug use is a mechanism for coping with stress. That this hyper-competitivism has an effect, and in some cases is the cause of why people seek out drugs and why drug abuse exists. Now, all that said, look, I'm a capitalist too. I believe, and I've said this before, the key to America maintaining and retaining and sustaining its dominance for the short term and the long term is through its economy. Period, the end. But I do feel like there's room to consider how this hyper competitiveness can negatively impact your workforce, negatively impact your society, and people need a release. People are not robots. They cannot work 24/7, and people struggle with 40 hours a week. So there has to be a balance. There has to be an acceptance that the harder you work your people, the more likely they are to burn out. And this is not like pseudoscience. There's a lot of legitimate studies that point to the fact that the harder you work your workforce, the more likely they are to burn out. It's going to decrease productivity. It's going to impact efficiency. So a balance has to be struck. And I think that in general, businesses struggle to find that right balance. I think there's some blame to go around. I'm not going to say businesses are really to blame. I think that there needs to be leaders who understand this fact and acknowledge it. It can cause drug abuse the more pressure you put on people. You would never say this stuff to someone's face, I mean, and then not expect to get punched in the face. Especially if you just lost a son. I mean, it's a highly emotional period of time. Yeah. I mean, a father who loves his son, who's a present father, is not going to accept someone besmirching and denigrating the memory of their loved one in their face. I think most people would have an emotional reaction to that. And so...
Or even, I'm not even saying that, but you're right about that. But I'm saying even, let's say you had something rude to say Bruce Rivers, or you didn't like him for some reason, right? Mm-hmm. But you saw the pain, you were walking up to him, you saw the pain and hurt on his face. I think most people say, this ain't the time for that. You know what I'm saying? Your compassion, seeing his humanity, would tell you, nah, I ain't gonna do that.
There's a number of factors that go into why people say certain things. Sometimes they have mental issues, they're not good communicators, they grew up in a different social economic situation, they're just not social, they don't have communication skills. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. I think if we look at those factors, that usually has an impact on why people say certain things. Now behind the screen, people feel bolder to say certain things.
That's what I'm saying.
And that's what I'll say. I'll agree. People feel bolder to say certain things. The distance and not having somebody
in front of you and having anonymity on your side, but that's the real person on that side, right? You see them making the show. They don't see you watching it, right? So the disconnect, I feel we're in an unnatural situation, which makes us unnaturally lose our empathy. Lose... You know, like they say, we have like mirror neurons, right? We see people, like, I feel like I can watch a video of a skateboarder fall on a rail and hit his balls, and it hurts me. Okay? So we have those mirror neurons in us, and I just think that not seeing the person, being distant from them, being behind anonymity cultivates in us
insensitivity.
Yeah,
and I agree with you. When we played video games, what we found is people will talk shit, in a game. If you go to their home and knock on their door, and
change your tune.
As to have a conversation with them, step outside of the house real quick. Would you like to repeat what you just said to me? In a virtual world, they're not answering that door. They're not coming. They're not passing that threshold. They're gonna turn the lights off and cower underneath their bed.
I think there's levels to that. The thing is, and I agree with you. I heard the most horrible, most insulting things playing FPS, playing Half-Life online. Nobody will ever diss me more than I was playing a game online in the 90s, okay? It will never happen.
The 90s was the Wild Wild West.
But I just think the difference between kids competitively and
being racist?
Playing against each other, having bravado and just trying to show each other up. It's what young guys do. I feel like there's a difference between that and just critiquing someone, insulting somebody just after they lost a child. I don't know. Why do it?
Listen,
even if you think
this is part of...
Why you have to post it?
Right, but this is part of the unfortunate reality of free speech, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
My free speech doesn't begin or end where you agree or disagree. And I think that's the key to having an open society where you can talk about problems and contemplate solutions. It's not going to be clean. It's going to be messy. I think it's gotten better, I would say, since the 90s. I mean, 90s, it was really bad.
Well, it's only...
But I think companies have extended their policies, their use policy, their EULAs, which basically not outlaw, but they consider it a violation of their policies to be making comments like that. Now, obviously, it depends on how it's said. Like if they say...
I think that's what they've changed. They've not changed what they're doing, they've changed how they're doing it.
How they're saying it.
Yeah,
and I think that's the key. And so that's what I mean when I say it's gotten better. Like in the 90s, you could say whatever the hell you wanted. True. Racist, transphobic, misogynistic. You take your pick of the ist or the isms, and you could get away with it in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah.
But now it's a lot different.
Yeah.
And so companies have taken precautions to ensure that they're not liable, or at least they're showing that they're trying to address the concern before it potentially becomes a much bigger issue.
One more thing, it just reminded me of something, then we'll close it off. I don't think it's working yet, but I know they're working on AIs that, let's say you're playing Call of Duty on Microsoft. They'd have AI continuously looking at everybody talking in their different games. The AI would pick out words that you use and it would mute you for being a troll or whatever, right? What do you think about that? Because I can see that being adopted first there maybe, but then you send a tweet out, it gets killed.
Yeah.
And so you have an AI bot, and then how do you dispute it? I'd like to get somebody to help me with this. Oh wait, there's no phone number, there's no customer service, there's no one to correct it.
Anytime that words are censored, there could be a log of it. That'd be one way. And
I'm saying, but as a customer, I have a problem with an account on Facebook.
Well, I mean, but I'm telling you.
How do I get help to fix it? There's no way. There's no one to call. There's nobody for me to talk to.
You have to talk. Well, no, I don't think that's true. You have to speak with customer support and just go through that process.
You find that number and let me know.
I didn't say number. You have to use the chat option because it's the only way.
They have like a low quality chat bot tell me, "I'm sorry, did this help you? Yes or no?"
It's Facebook. Isn't there AI model?
He hasn't implemented it yet.
Superior? No.
Well, I think it's an interesting idea that if we have AI with the parameters you're talking about, which will probably only get stricter, watching you in real time and either muting you or editing you out of posts. What are we going to do then, man?
That was happening already during the aftermath of the terrorist attack on Israel that was launched from Gaza, where social media platforms were stifling free speech at the behest of the administration. And what ended up happening was American citizens were impacted by that. And I kind of feel like the social media companies should have took a much bolder stance, harder stance.
They capitulated.
Yeah, very easily, because they had a direct line to the CEO of that company, which allowed them to pressure that individual to violate American citizens' free speech. And I think with an example, with the case that you're presenting, I think that's actually going to present a much more significant concern during future Democratic administrations who want to silence you because you do not agree with their positions and their opinions.
This is the thing. It's one thing to have...
That's dystopian future right there.
To post something, it get flagged, you argue about it, it either gets kept or you delete a part of a video or a blog or whatever. There's a difference between that and then, for instance, you upload, like when I get done this podcast, I upload it, and as it's uploading, AI is also watching it and clipping out stuff that it doesn't like. You know what I'm saying? Or like as you're speaking to somebody in Call of Duty, you are being muted. Because a person can only do so much. But an AI bot can watch everybody, and in a illogical way, it can enforce rules that silence people.
I think that it's possible to do something like that. There's always been an issue, especially with non-technical people interpreting technical information and drawing inaccurate conclusions from that information. This is, for decades, this has been an issue. The immediate consequence of that is that this is why context matters so much more, is because contextually, if you're only looking for keywords, you could be silencing somebody who's not doing anything inappropriate.
Exactly.
And I think AI could potentially, if programmed correctly, to look at the body of the conversation, not the key word, it could be utilized more intelligently. But can that be done yet? I don't know.
But I think what they'll have is like a general rule. If you detect this word, just delete the minute before, the minute after, with including the word, right? Like they'll have a general rule like that. It won't be like you, where they're like, well, read the whole paragraph and then see it in context. And no, they'll just have a general rule. If this word comes up or this phrase comes up, delete a minute before and after it, take it out.
That would likely occur. And I think with humans, it would be able to see, because I would equate that version 1.0 of video editing as synonymous with what humans do now, which is it's not efficient.
No.
And most individuals who are reviewing content, they're probably finding the fastest way. I would assume that they are doing this because they have a lot of fact checking that they have to do. So they're looking at.
We only check like 10% of the crates that come in on the ports, right? Because there's so many that come in, we can't check them all. Same thing with like YouTube. There's billions of hours of video created a day. You can only sift through so much. You only have so many people.
Yeah, you have to have. That. Well, so what AI does is it bubbles up those instances of the highest, the most interest, the content of most interest that a human must look at or should look at. So it's kind of helping to filter through the ocean of videos and rising certain videos that should be looked at.
But how long before it just does the editing itself?
I mean, a lot of key factors. I think that requires a lot of processing power to do, and that's why you need AI data centers.
Oh yeah,
and
which
also,
they're building.
Yeah, I mean they're being built.
Yeah.
But it kind of depends on what purpose they're being built for. These have to be purpose-built AI data centers, which are either doing things like regulating your platform or doing other more fun things like finding keywords in your heads-up display that you can use to do additional research on through your heads-up display, just as an example.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, if you're the CEO of Meta, do you want to utilize your AI capacity for policing, or do you want to use it for developing?
COVID? Remember, everybody who's had a different opinion than the main opinion was edited, and if he had AI power,
for the next
he would have edited even more.
Yeah, well,
yes.
I mean that's a question. That's a cross that the CEO of Meta is going to have to decide, because if money's never really an issue when you're in the technology upper tier. That's not an issue. But it's where do you want to apply your resources? You do have a finite amount of resources early on that you have to bring to bear to solve one problem versus another. This is, unfortunately, with tech CEOs, they're not well versed in politics. So they don't understand that they have some standing to say, no, I will not do that. Or this is enough. This is good enough. We've done this, we've done that, we've done this and that. And now we have a nascent AI program that's snipping and looking for keywords. And that has to be good enough for now.
No, what you're saying. We don't live in a dictatorship. You can't tell me exactly.
Well, not for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
Not for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
Now, when that pendulum swings the other way, who knows? Because it's very possible. I mean, because that's what was happening during the previous administration. People's free speech was being infringed upon, and it was happening in such a way that it's in the shadows. Is the CEO of a social media platform going to bring a suit against the federal government for violations of free speech? Probably not.
Most likely not.
Most likely not. Now, could they? If they have specific examples of how the administration is using pressure tactics and influencing them to manipulate their platform in such a way that silences conservatives, would that be worth something that the public would like to know? Abso-fucking-lutely. But that, back to what I said, they're not well versed in politics. And so I think that they would be less inclined to do that. It's going to happen eventually. And I think, for better or for worse, Elon is kind of what he calls himself, a free speech absolutist. And again, for better or for worse, the fact that he's kind of in that bubble, that tech bubble, and he's advocating for complete free speech, it's both a positive and a negative, but at least there's somebody there who's picking up the torch and championing these ideas that free speech, it needs to be considered sacrosanct. Because there's lots of examples to point to where others were experiencing these headaches from the previous administration, and they were doing nothing. They were doing what they were told. They were folding to the pressure.
Absolutely.
Until they got to a point where they started to realize, like, wait a second, you're telling us to censor an American citizen's speech. You're telling us to do that. And why are you telling us to do that? Oh, we can't tell you why we're telling you to do that. Oh, okay, well then we're not going to do it. What's the reasoning behind this censoring? And they're given no answer. If they're given no answer, I think that is the moment when they started to realize, like, they are violating the First Amendment. And that's when they started to realize, we need to push back on this. But what immediately came of that was nothing. Just going back to what you said about the AI being able to snip and do, I think it's probably on par with what humans do right now, but it's not utilized that way. It's just bubbling up to human review. Now, future iterations, sure, I think they could look at the totality of the sentence or paragraph very quickly, scan it, look for keywords, compare them together, and with another layered program on top of that, another artificial intelligence layered on top of that, could determine based on the weighting of certain keywords and the context in which they're utilized, that syntax could provide like a score that basically says either this needs to be bubbled up to a human or this needs to be censored. And maybe add like another layer where there's a human review.
I agree. I'll close it out with this. I agree. I do think there will be a system where a real human will be notified of certain things that are said. But I do think eventually AI will be listening to you real time as you create on platforms, and it will edit you in real time. And that's going to be horrible for free speech going forward.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree.